Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and there's a well-known phrase used to describe remarkable men who seem to have an unusually wide array of interests and knowledge and talents. The phrase is a Renaissance man. Well, on this edition of L'Chaim, I am thrilled to be sitting with a Renaissance woman, Abigail Pogrebin, a most remarkable, talented, interesting woman who occupies a unique position on the American Jewish scene. Let me tell you a little bit about Abby Pogrebin. For many years, she was a television producer for some of the biggest names in television journalism, including Fred Friendly, Charlie Rose, Bill Moyers, and at 60 Minutes for Mike Wallace. Abby's a prolific writer, with her pieces appearing in New York Magazine, the New York Times travel section, the Huffington Post, The Beast, as well as the Jewish Forward and Tablet. Her latest book describes what it's like to be an identical twin, entitled One and the Same, My Life as an Identical Twin, and What I've Learned About Everyone's Struggle to Be Singular. And Abigail Pogrebin is the author of a 2005 book that's become iconic on the American Jewish scene, entitled Stars of David, Prominent Jews Talking About Being Jewish. And you may have seen on Shalom TV, Abby's moderating a program at the 92nd Street Y, where she interviewed three of the celebrities profiled in Stars of David, Leonard Nimoy, Kira Sedgwick, and Jason Alexander, with whom, by the way, Abby shared the experience of a Broadway musical since she was, as a teenager, also a part of the cast in the 1981 Stephen Sondheim show, Merrily We Roll Along. And Abby's heading back to Broadway since Stars of David is currently being adapted for the Broadway stage. Currently, Abby will be writing a regular series for the Jewish Forward, and it is so wonderful to have you sitting at this table. Thank you for going out of your way.
I feel like I've died and gone to heaven with that introduction. I'm done. I'm finished.
And you're just beginning.
And I'm just
You're
beginning.
just
no,
beginning.
I'm old, but I'm happy thanks to you.
There's so much I want to talk to you about.
Great.
And I first want to just begin with you personally. We've talked already. You grew up on the Upper West Side.
Like every Jew in New York. Yes.
Okay. But you know, you wrote, I saw that you wrote that you did not feel you really belonged. Do you remember writing that? Yeah. That somehow, even though you grew up on the Upper West Side, there was something about it that felt strange to you.
You know what I think? I felt very comfortable on the Upper West Side. I didn't necessarily feel like I had a Jewish home.
Uh-huh.
And that's what you probably read. I didn't really have a Jewish place, despite the fact that Judaism is in the water on the Upper West Side. And that was probably a contradiction. Like, why was that so hard to find?
Okay, take a step back for one second. By the way, I think many people know, but some people don't know. You have a famous mother.
I have a very famous mother.
Letty.
Right.
Who was one of the founders of Ms. Magazine.
Right, back in 1972.
Okay. So you were a child at that point.
I was a kid when she created Ms. Yes, I'm not that old.
Okay. So what I want to know is, how did that affect you? How did being Letty Pogrebin's daughter affect you? And here she is, a major feminist figure on the American scene. Mm-hmm. I do want you to talk about how did it, play into the Jewish aspect of your growing up.
Okay.
People already know you have a twin sister. Any other siblings?
Identical twin, Robin, who writes for the New York Times.
Yes.
I have a younger brother, David.
Who also writes?
No, he's in the restaurant business.
Okay,
actually.
all right.
He took a different path.
Okay, and is he younger or older?
He's 3 years younger.
Okay.
So there's three of us.
Okay. So just talk for a moment. What was it like growing up in your parents' home and then segue into the Jewish part?
Okay. So, I mean, obviously when you grow up with an activist, it's all you know. You know, there was no moment. I sort of grew up in her activism, so there was no eureka moment where mom was suddenly a different person. You know, you can imagine the conversations at the dinner table were very lively. And even when we were kids, young kids, we were told to kind of sees our opportunity that Robin and I should have a right to be on the softball team the same way that my brother did. We were very conscious of also injustice in the world. That was definitely a regular conversation at the table, and not just in terms of sexism, but in terms of when it came to race, sexual orientation, any kind of exclusionary politics. My parents were very sensitive to, very attuned to.
By the way, in all fairness, who's your father?
Yeah.
Here?
Oh, people always forget Bert.
Yes.
But he was an
Bernie?
equal part, Bert,
Bert.
B-E-R-T, as in Bertrand. He's a labor lawyer, and also shares my mother's politics. And in a way, I mean, I don't just want to laugh about it. They really had a project together, I think, that wasn't so conscious, but was just kind of a given. They had a very egalitarian marriage, and their parenting was very collaborative. So, you know, my dad knew everything that was going on in our lives the same way my mother did. In fairness, they had very traditional roles when it came to play dates and doctor's appointments and shopping for, you know, clothes when we ran out of something. And my mother was the organizer, and she was still doing she was still the cook and organizing meals. And she's actually quite a homemaker, my mother.
Which you wouldn't imagine.
Which you wouldn't imagine. In fact, my mother just had a birthday. I think she would be public about a big birthday. She turned 75, and all of the friends who toasted her talked about her, the way she sets a table and creates a home. And it was so counterintuitive to what people assume, because she's been in the streets and such an activist, and obviously writing and working all the time. I will say also that my mother set a very high bar. There's no question about it. I don't have to take you into my therapy. She set a high standard because she managed to do it all, which I've now learned is harder than it looks when Letty's doing it. She always had the magazine, and then she was writing books. She was always productive, but also very effective, and also very loving. She was kind of making Halloween costumes and changing the world at the same time.
That's amazing.
And that's a hard, as wonderful as that is, she's unusual. And I realize it now that I'm an adult, but when I was a kid, I thought it was just the way.
You took it for granted.
Yeah.
I wanted you to follow up on it one more
Sure.
moment. One could expect that your mother was so involved in Ms. Magazine and the cause. And you've now really expanded what that cause was. Your parents were involved in fighting for social justice in many areas.
Right.
That she would not have been a good mother. She would not have been a present mother. To what extent, it sounds to me like, in fact, she was.
Incredibly present.
Incredibly present.
Yeah.
Don't you give her enormous credit for that?
I give her enormous credit for that, and I also think it shows that priorities can, I certainly think we were the priority, but I think priorities can be balanced. It doesn't mean necessarily that you can do it all. I don't think that should be the message, because I actually think my mother is unique in her energy and in her organization, and it takes both. In other words, to be there for every show that Robin and I were in, and we were constantly performing, I'm sure to the point we were incredibly annoying. She never missed a show. She never missed a dance recital. She never missed a parent-teacher conference. But I also know, but she was also working very hard until late into the night. So she was somebody who was kind of managing more than I think the average person can. And I give her tremendous credit for that. But I also think that people need to be realistic, that that is sort of unusual. And you don't want to beat yourself up if you can't match it.
Okay, you have 2 children.
I have 2 children, a boy and a girl.
Okay, you've had also a wonderful career.
Thank you.
How have you been able to mother?
Yeah, I think I feel very blessed. I've had a wonderful career, but I definitely had to make a big change to manage it, and that was leaving 60 Minutes. And some people would say that that was a mistake, because I left at a point, it was a dream job. It was the dream job in television. I was first producing for Ed Bradley, and then I switched over to Mike Wallace. Both were giants. And I learned so much. I traveled the world, literally. I was in Rwanda right after the massacre there. I was in Estonia. I was in El Salvador.
Abby, was it exciting?
It was exciting is, yes. That is the word in tenfold. It was an incredible job in your 20s. I
get chills.
And then you get married, and then you have a kid, and suddenly you're on the tarmac at 6 a.m. going away, and you have this little baby home. And, I'm not going to play the violins, but it was very hard for me. And I think a lot of parents, I won't just say mothers, run into that moment. I do think that often it's women who struggle a little bit harder, partly because we've maybe been wired that way, to have that kind of parenting role be so primary. it became too difficult for me to be away as much as you need to for 60 minutes. For 60 minutes, you go where the story is, and you go for a while because you need to make sure the story's there and make sure you've set it up for the correspondent. They do a tremendous amount of work, but you do a tremendous amount of preparation. And it was just untenable, for me, it was untenable to be a parent and have that job. So I made a switch to writing for print.
How hard?
It was actually not as hard as I thought it should be, but I think people in my life were surprised. Because
You're married to David Shapiro.
I'm married to a great guy.
Okay, this was something you discussed.
We discussed it. It was definitely my impetus, but I think we both agreed, because he travels too, that
He didn't push you.
He never pushed me genuinely. Never pushed me, to his credit.
This came from inside you.
It really
After you
did.
had your first child.
Yes, Ben. And so I stayed at 60 Minutes another year, and then I decided I needed to make a change, and thank goodness I was able to transfer to print journalism, which I might not be as easy as it was to do. It wasn't easy, but it was definitely doable. And that's what I did. I started writing for magazines, and then ultimately I wrote 2 books.
Okay.
So.
Very interesting. Take a half step back now.
Okay.
Who were your mother's parents?
My mother's parents, one of them died very sadly when my mother was 15. That's her mother. Her name was Seal, and she died of cancer when my mother was 15. That was a seminal moment for my mother.
That's tragic.
Because my mother was a very unusually educated Jew for a girl at that time. She had been a bat mitzvah, which, as you know, girls weren't really in those days. And despite all of my mother's education, she wasn't allowed to participate in the minyan, solely because she was female. And that was a pivotal moment for her in terms of her Judaism. And she left it behind for quite a number of years. I fell in those cracks, so that's why we didn't get a Jewish education.
Yeah, we'll come to that in a moment.
But my mother's father was a very involved macher in Queens. I think he was president of his synagogue. His name was Jack Cotton. He was a lawyer. He looked like Errol Flynn, had a lot of panache, and he wore a lot of cologne, I remember. I never knew my grandmother, which is very sad.
Do you think they were an influence in your mother in terms of the direction she took, this passion for social justice, and then
That's
founding
so
Ms.
interesting.
Magazine?
You know, no one's ever asked me that. No one, and that's something I've never really thought about. I think that my parents influenced my mother in 2 ways in terms of her trajectory. One, because she lost her mother so young, my mother was forced to grow up very fast, and she really did. So when I talk about my mother's effectiveness, I think that's partly because at 15 years old, she kind of was suddenly parenting herself in a certain way. I think her father was involved, but he wasn't a parent the way parents would be today. He also remarried, which was very painful for her, very quickly, to the point where I think she even came home from college and lost her room. And there were moments, so in that sense, she kind of, I think, was on her own 2 feet, making it on her own in a way that, shaped her. In terms of Judaism, there's no question that my grandfather taught her a tremendous amount. Because he didn't have a boy, he really gave it to Letty. And she met the challenge. I think she was a very well-instructed Jew. And to this day, she has it in her bones. She has it in her DNA. That said, there were limits about what a girl could do. And so I think even he felt like you can't go beyond this. I wouldn't say that my grandparents were activists, though.
Okay. I'm just wondering where what propelled your mother to put so much of her own energy, not simply to social justice, but specifically into the feminist revolution.
Absolutely. No, and you're right. Feminism really is the focus.
Right.
I mean, that for no question. It was really the organizing principle of her life until she got very involved in Israel, which we can also talk about. She describes it, and I almost remember this, but again, I was too young for this moment. I think it was literally reading one article, and I wish I could remember the author. It wasn't, The Feminine Mystique. It was one article that was one of those light bulb moments. And I think that my mother always had sort of innate sense of something being wrong or right, but it was that article that suddenly galvanized her. And she soon met up with Gloria Steinem. I can't remember who introduced them. It was Gloria's idea to start a magazine. And my mother had been in publishing and was a writer. Not a published writer yet, I think, although she might have written her first book. I doubt it, though, because her first book was called How to Make It in a Man's World. So the feminist moment hadn't quite happened. And all of this converged. I think the article, meeting Gloria, and I'm sure I'm skipping details, but I do remember it was really a sea change, and thank God my father went right with her.
Yes.
He was never an activist in that way, I want to be clear, but he was a supporter like I think no other man in this world is.
Then the other question is, how does this really affect you and Robin?
Yeah.
Your girls.
Yeah.
Growing up in an iconic mother's home,
Right.
where feminism, you may disagree with me, I don't know. I think that the notion that women are valuable, important, should be educated, leaving ritual barriers aside, in general, the Jewish world does want their girls educated. They want them to be as professional as they want to be. Mm-hmm. And there's a sense of encouragement, certainly from my parents on. And my mother was one of the first women ever to go to Columbia Law School.
Wow.
Okay, so I've got that in my background. My grandmother, who also went to Columbia Art School as an older adult and was a major figure in early Jewish education. So that I saw that developing, even though I don't have any sisters. Mm-hmm. I grew up also in the Reconstructionist movement, where Mordechai Kaplan's daughters were the first girls in America to have a bat mitzvah ceremony.
Wow.
But my sense in general is that you don't have an anti-feminist mentality in the average Jewish household. I want to know the extent to which you agree with that. And then the question is, as you and your daughter, as you and your sister, Robin, were growing up, to what extent do you feel you were in some way different than the typical Jewish girls growing up on the Upper West Side?
Yeah. Well, I think it really matters what era you're talking about, because I certainly think that in my mother's era, there was a sexist slant in terms of expectations of what a girl could achieve and how much she should know and learn. I do think that used to be the case. I also think that in very, very observant Orthodox homes today, that is still the case to a point. I know that there is a value in education, but I think it's limited in terms of what a Jewish girl can do in the Jewish world professionally. And I say that partly because we can talk about this later, but I wrote a story for New York Magazine on the controversy when Avi Weiss ordained the first woman in Orthodox Judaism, Sarah Hurwitz. Did not call her a rabbi, as you know, called her a rabbah. That was enough to set off the fireworks. And so when I was deeply reporting that, I really had to understand halakha on this subject and what the resistance was to women being on the bima. Mm-hmm. And that is obviously a very complicated conversation, but I came up still, and this was only 2 years ago, of what those limitations still are for many Jews. So that's why I'm careful in saying all the barriers are down, and you can be and do whatever you want, and great if you have this education, go, go, go. I don't think that, I wouldn't agree fully.
Are you limiting it, though, to the Orthodox community?
I am.
Okay.
That's why I was going to say, in Reform Judaism, absolutely, I think the barriers are down. And I certainly would say a conservative is close.
Right, we really talk about non-Orthodoxy.
Non-Orthodoxy. And I think in terms of my sister and in terms of me, if there was one ethic, if I was going to distill it, it was reach for anything and don't let anything stand in your way. That was the ethic. So that's a feminist ethic, and it's a Jewish ethic.
Yes, it is.
Right?
Yes.
I mean, because I think Jewish parents are always like, do and reach, and you should have. They also say, educate, work hard. It's not that I'm bestowing this gift on you,
right,
and you are this privileged person. It's you got to work your butt off, your tuchus off. But it also is saying, nobody should tell you can't do it. That to me is a very Jewish idea. When I interviewed Joan Rivers, she actually said, to her that was Judaism. Nobody tells me I can't do this. It's a very feminist idea too. It's sort of what the message was from both my parents, especially my mother, is if somebody says this actually isn't a path for you, or you shouldn't do this because you're a girl,
Good for you. Was there any hint of your being either, were you disappointed in any way? Was your mother disappointed in any way? Did you feel in any way somebody was going to be critical of you? When you, at what was a professional zenith, decided to leave 60 Minutes to be a mother?
Well, if I had just left to be a mother, there might have been more criticism. I left and continued working.
Correct.
And in that sense, I think I need to say that because you're right, or you've touched on a chord. I think if I had not worked, I think it would have been hard for my mother. That doesn't mean that she would have judged me or shunned me. I just think that she would have thought you have a lot to offer in the world. And I think for her, mothering entirely by itself is redundant. And I think any one of us who has been a parent sees that the day in, day out, especially when children are little, it has a tremendous repetition that in some ways can be stultifying after a while. That said, I think she is a tremendous mother and grandmother, and gets why that for me was guiding.
That's wonderful.
You know, and I do need to call out her grandmotherness.
Good.
Because she's very involved that way. That said, I think you know how much this push me pull you between career and family is constantly and still a very living issue. And the fact that I went to Yale and got an Ivy League education, as did my twin sister, and so many of my friends who have had great educations have decided to stop working, is, I think, a complicated issue for women often. I didn't stop. My sister hasn't stopped. Most of my friends are doing something for sure and doing interesting things. But are we in the traditional career track? Not exactly. Mm-hmm. And I think some people have trouble with that.
Mm-hmm. Now come to the Jewish part.
Okay, the Jews.
Okay, so.
This is 40 years in the desert, Mark.
I want to understand, how was it, and you've touched on it a little bit, how was it that your mother's journey took you, your sister, and your brother sort of away from a Jewish core? And then I want to know how
I came back.
How you come back, and I want to hear about your mother in Israel.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
So, because my mother had this moment, which was very difficult and painful, at that moment it wasn't a political decision, I think, to turn her back from Jewish ritual. I think she was actually deeply hurt and alienated from a tradition that could, in a sense, not be there for her right when she needed it the most. And so, the personal becomes political. And as she grew up and became a feminist, she saw the patriarchal tradition reject women in many turns and kind of rejected the whole thing. Now, I have to say, we had Shabbat in our home. We were in synagogue twice a year. I don't know if you know about the Fire Island Synagogue, but we used to go as a family to Salt Air, which is a beach community where there are no cars and everyone goes barefoot. And nobody wanted to go home on the high holidays, and so they decided to start sort of their own congregation. And nobody really knew the prayers except for my mother. So that's what began to bring her back. She became the cantor for that makeshift congregation.
Really?
She wrote a piece about it called Barefoot in Shul. It was an absolutely powerful thing, a wonderful community. Hundreds would go. They had their own machzor. The whole thing became a tremendous tradition. But it brought back everything she'd learned. And so suddenly she was a leader, a Jewish leader in that sense, having to reconjure all the things that were in her DNA. And she began to find, without going into every detail, a Jewish path that was also egalitarian. I think also what was happening at the same time was you had the Sally Prizans of the world, and you had people, women becoming rabbis. And so the landscape was changing, and my mother could find her place in it. She then came back very strongly. But in those years, I did not go to Hebrew school. I did not become a bat mitzvah, neither did my twin sister, and my brother was not a bar mitzvah. And it was just something that passed us by. Then
Did you know you were Jewish?
I knew I was Jewish in a very real way. I think, first of all, because, again, just Jewish ritual was part of our house. I didn't even mention the Hanukkah tradition, which was elaborate. My mother always felt strongly that we should never...
So really, it's no synagogue life.
It's no synagogue life.
But
and it's no education.
No formal education.
Formal education. It's in the home.
But you have Shabbat?
We have Shabbat whenever we are all home. Yes.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
And Hanukkah. What about Passover?
And Passover. And I had 3 Seders. because there was the one at Aunt Betty's, the one at cousin. I'm blanking on his name. Well, it changed. Yes. It was from Aunt Tilly, and then there was the feminist Seder starting in 1976 that my sister and I went to. So yes, I'm absorbing a lot of Judaism, and then there's also the social justice, which is obviously very Jewish.
And there's a pride in being Jewish.
Tremendous pride in being Jewish. No apologies for it. No anti-Semitism in my feeling. When I went to Yale, I didn't go to Hillel. And I regret that, actually, because I've now been in touch with James Ponet, and that was a real loss on my part. I think I went to one Shabbos. But I did go to a synagogue on the high holidays on campus, and I just didn't stay very long.
And you still were Jewish? You knew you were Jewish?
I knew I was Jewish.
No question about it.
Right. But I think when you lack, as you know, all the things you have in your kind of in your body,
yes.
You know, when you don't have that and you walk into synagogue, you're kind of vamping. You're doing the best you can.
And you don't feel comfortable.
And you don't feel comfortable.
Right. Okay. And that's, by the way, what you meant when you said you're on the Upper West Side,
but not
Jewish,
feeling,
but you don't feel comfortable really
right.
in terms of synagogue communal
right.
stuff.
And I think actually, before we even get into the book that kind of
yes.
changed things for me, I did decide to take Hebrew as a class when I was at Yale. And I think that looking back on that, and I took Jewish literature, it was kind of the beginning of my wanting to fill in these blanks. And I took Hebrew with this woman, Miri Kabovi, who's this fiery character, Israeli. She taught us vocabulary by using the Israeli Top 40, which in the 1980s when I was in college, she had to record it off of a shortwave radio. So I was listening to these songs that were so popular that when I then went to Israel, I was completely fluent in pop culture. Of course, those songs are outdated now. And I lost all the Hebrew after I graduated because I didn't keep it up. So it was kind of like I'm grabbing at something, but not getting a toehold, a foothold, a handhold, whatever you call it.
And then what happens in your life, and all of a sudden, the Jewish part becomes very important?
Yeah. So I have a son, and I remember thinking at his bris, I saw this little yarmulke on his tiny head, and my mother, you know, we had the moil everyone has, and you pass the baby from one generation to another, and of course you're sobbing, and you're also very hormonal. And I just looked at that yarmulke on his head and said, this really matters. I'm making a choice right now for this child to join, I always get just emotional thinking about it, a very powerful ancient chain. Do you know, Abby, what the heck you're doing? Do you know what that means? And I felt that embarrassed almost that I didn't have that answer. Like, I should have that answer. And when this child grows up, I should be able to explain it to him. This is why you had a bris. This is why we go to synagogue on high holidays. This is why we have a Seder. This is what it means to be a Jew. And it's not just that we were born to it. I chose it. I chose it. Not having that answer made me begin to say, Abby, you need to understand the choice if you're going to make it.
I find this so fascinating and so revelatory. I want to know whether you agree with me. A life situation propelled you into this. It wasn't a theory. It wasn't academic. It wasn't people said you ought to. Out of a real life experience, all of a sudden you wanted to. One of the things I've been arguing is that while it's wonderful to teach children as much as we can about being Jewish, their Jewish tradition, Hebrew, whatever, preparing them for a bar or bat mitzvah ceremony, as important it is to get teenagers involved in Jewish life, as important it is to get young, teens in early 20s involved. It seems to me that the time when a young Jew, is most open to wanting to learn for themselves is when they begin a family. 100%. And that's what happened to you.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, it didn't matter, because a lot of this you had heard before, but it grabbed you somehow inside you, yes?
That is true.
Then what happens?
Then I write Stars of David.
So everybody should have seen Stars of David.
Thank you.
They've seen it a million times on Shalom TV. How do you even think of doing this?
I think I was looking in my own sort of, behind the scenes struggle with what does it mean to be a Jew and to choose it. I'm looking at public figures all the time. And, as much as I'm reading the New Republic and the New Yorker, I'm also reading People magazine, like a lot of people, and saying, I know that person's Jewish, and I know that Supreme Court justice is Jewish, and I know that athlete's Jewish, but what does that actually mean for them? And I don't mean some kind of cute, I'm proud to be a Jew. I don't want the slogans. I want the truth, because I know this is a complicated area for anyone who was born to it. And at some point, like it was for me, you have to face it. You have to wrestle with it. If you decide to shelve it, that's its own thing. But at some point, I feel like it rears its head and says, you have to deal with me, this fact that you're a Jew.
Beautiful.
And so I was looking at people who are living a public life and thinking about this private part of them and saying, it's not in the Vanity Fair interviews. It's not what they want to talk about. It's not what people are asking about. I want to ask about it. And I want to sit down with them in person and actually have them tell me, face to face, does this mean anything to you? What were you raised with? Do you care that your children think that they're Jews? Did you worry about intermarrying? All those sort of, taboo questions I wanted to ask.
Good for you.
And I began.
And is it fair to say that because of where you had been in your own professional life, you had access to people that somebody else might not have had
People have
access
asked
to?
me how I managed to get
Yes.
62 famous people, and there's no question that you needed the beginnings of ties. The one thing I would say, though, it was plenty hard, and that's because all of these famous people are surrounded by people whose job it is to tell you no.
Isn't that so frustrating?
Beyond. And I don't think I could write that book today. I wrote it in 2005.
Why?
I think that where
The
there
world
were
has changed even
there were
more?
3 people in the way, now there are 20. And they all want to tell you no. So no matter how much of a pushy Jew you are, and I'm pretty pushy, you're cajoling, you're trying. And basically I started with 5. I started with 5
Who were the 5?
famous people.
Who were they?
And I thought if I can get these 5,
Others
they will
will fall?
convince
Yes,
others will fall.
absolutely right.
That's
Who were the
what-
5?
They were Gloria Steinem,
Yes.
who I had the connection. Leonard Nimoy, who was in a Torah study class with my parents by chance. They were not necessarily.
helps.
That helps. Mike Wallace, my boss at 60 Minutes.
And he said yes.
A controversial Jew because, he did all these pieces
Yes.
on the Middle East, which people felt were too sympathetic to the
Yes.
Arab point of view.
Yes.
He said yes, despite, in fact, he was very bruised by those accusations. Wendy Wasserstein, may she
Yes.
rest in peace. And Sarah Jessica Parker. So
How'd
Sarah
you know
Jessica
her?
Parker's husband went to school with me at a school called Walden in New York.
Matthew Broderick?
Matthew Broderick. He also happens to be a Jew,
Yes.
although he's not in my book, unfortunately. But I knew when I wrote to Sarah Jessica that she wouldn't think I was a crazed stalker because I could say Matthew and I went to school together.
Okay.
Those were the 5.
Okay, and that led to the others.
And that led to the others.
Did the show that you were in with Jason have any help for you?
That's true. Jason I didn't do as one of the first interviews, but there's no question Jason said yes.
Okay.
Because we were in that
Okay.
Broadway show together.
Yeah, just take one little moment. I'm
Yeah.
involved in Broadway. The audience knows about it.
Okay.
What's that?
How'd that happen?
Yeah, what's that?
I know. So when I was a kid, that's what I thought I was going to do.
Broadway.
I thought
You were on the stage.
God willing. I thought I was going to be on the stage.
You love to sing and dance.
I love to sing and dance. You can hear in my voice I can't sing anymore. And I actually had one of those kid belts. I was never a great singer, let's be honest about it, since we're Jews.
But you loved it.
I loved it. And I was in shows, when you're a kid and you love it, you can do it.
Of course.
And at 16 years old, I had the incredible fortune to be cast in this Broadway show. It was the first.
Stephen Sondheim,
I know,
for heaven's sakes.
nuts. And Harold Prince directing.
Yes.
It was crazy. And it was a huge flop.
Were you in the chorus?
I was in the ensemble, Mark.
The ensemble, excuse
Okay.
me. But it was a kid,
And I
wasn't
actually
it?
had a part. We were all kids, and we were supposed to be basically the show goes back in time chronologically.
Correct.
Incredible score by
Right,
Sondheim.
right.
We ran for only 16 performances.
Right.
We were a total disaster, but
You had 52
it was
previews,
a
it's
great.
okay.
We had a lot of previews. I love that. I love you for knowing that. We previewed a long time, so we performed a long time,
Uh-huh.
and we also rehearsed a long time because they cast us a year before rehearsals
Okay.
began.
What a thrill for you.
It was the thrill of a lifetime.
It was.
It was beyond. I mean, it was surreal.
You were on a Broadway stage.
I was on a Broadway stage.
Oh, my God.
I was.
Oh,
It
wow.
was. I was with my heroes. I mean, Stephen Sondheim. I could sing.
Yes.
I mean, when I was 10 years old, I could sing every song he'd ever.
Absolutely right.
And Hal Prince, Pajama Game, Little Night Music, you name it. Damn
These
Yankees.
are giants.
Giants.
And
So to
you were
see
in
them
this show.
falter was very sobering. But there, and I think it's obviously something you never forget. But it was a thrill beyond imagining.
Okay. Jason was in the cast
Jason
as
was
well.
in the cast.
Okay, Bowie, he is extraordinarily talented.
Incredible. A lot of people don't know he
No,
can
they
sing.
think he's only George.
They think he's only George. That's where he started on Broadway. That was obviously his first Broadway show. He went on to be in Rink, and I think Jerome
you ever
Robbins.
see Rink?
I saw Rink.
Was that a fabulous show?
It was a fabulous show. I
it
can't
didn't-
believe you saw it.
Rink
Terrific.
is one of my all-time favorite shows.
There's some great songs in that show.
And it was because Eliza got sick that the show folded.
Is that right?
Yes.
I didn't even know that.
Yes, she had her problems then. But it was a fabulous show.
Yes.
By two giants also.
Yes, Candor and Ebb.
Absolutely.
Amazing.
Absolutely. And most people don't know that show.
No, they don't know that
So
show.
I'm proud that you know that show.
I'm so glad we have a
And
whole other
Jason was-
interview to do sometime.
Jason was absolutely, well, I look forward to that. He was fabulous in that
fantastic.
show.
And he stayed friendly. I mean, we didn't really see each other, but when I wrote him, I knew he would say yes.
Okay, come back to the book now.
Okay. Oh, Sondheim's in my book too, and that was because of the show. So yes, you're right.
Okay.
I
that
had
helped.
a lot of tethers.
It helped. Okay. And, you were who you were. I don't think anybody could have done that book and
Yeah.
never done it as well.
Thank you.
Okay, now, I have one question for you.
Okay.
I don't know why. Why Kirish Sedgwick?
Because, what do you mean?
Oh, come on.
What? She's a very identified Jew.
You think so?
Absolutely. A
Okay.
very identified Jew. Mark.
Makes me feel better.
You should.
Okay.
But
Let it
basically-
be more, I understood.
I know. This was the rule of the book, which is actually important that you raised, Kira. All you had to be were two things, famous and Jewish. And then I wanted you to be honest about where that sat for you. Nora Ephron, many people think there couldn't be anyone more Jewish than Nora. Again, rest her in peace. She was very much an unidentified Jew.
Yeah.
She said it wouldn't be in the top 3 things I say about myself. It's a shanda, but that's how she felt. Where Ronald Perlman is importing a minion when he goes on vacation.
Exactly.
So I wanted people to be honest. I wanted this to be a book that was really true. Mm-hmm. And in the process of asking these very candid questions, I began to ask them of myself. Mm-hmm. So that is truly what happened. Mm-hmm. And that was radicalizing. Mm-hmm. Number one, I thought I needed to be more prepared for these interviews than it turned out I needed to be. And I don't say that at any fault of these famous people, but they haven't studied a lot of Torah. But I started to study Torah because I thought and worried I'd sort of be caught with my proverbial pants down and not know enough. So I began to study Torah once a week with this wonderful rabbi named Jennifer Krause. And we went through the entire Bible one year, and then I wanted to continue. And it's one of those things you know so well. The more you get it, the more you want it.
Absolutely.
And it just I went deeper and deeper
You had a bat mitzvah ceremony.
at age 40.
Mazal tov.
Thank you.
Mazal tov.
Thank you. That was quite a meaningful step, and
Was it?
also I think my family thought I'd gone on the deep end, off the deep end. It just, first of all, it had to be something I sort of created myself. In other words, we had to find I didn't belong to a synagogue at that time. I now do. We had to find the space. We had to find the Torah. We were building the ceremony, which was a very traditional ceremony, but that was powerful. To have my children, who were very young at the time, participate with the blessings, and to see their mother go through this and practicing
How fabulous
my
is that?
parsha, and it was
What was your parsha?
it was from Amor, and
No. You became bat mitzvah on Seder Emor?
I think.
We share Emor.
Oh, we're kidding me.
Which, by the way, is not a great Sedra.
No, it's terrible.
No, it's terrible.
But I
we
did have the
share
corners
Emor
of the fields. Am I right about
yes,
that? Yes, that's
for
a good line.
evermore, we share Emor.
Okay.
Have
you used that already?
No.
I'm not the first girl you've used that.
No, you're the first
Woman.
girl.
I should say
We share
for my
Emor.
mother.
That's wonderful. And you created this ceremony for yourself. Your children were there. How old were they?
They were,
young
gosh.
still, very young.
They're very young.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
It's
crazy.
very sweet.
It's very,
Very,
and
very sweet.
and I say they also, not they, my husband, my sister, my family. I think it was both bizarre and beautiful at the same time, because, and I want to be clear, it's not like I suddenly became an observant Jew overnight, but this suddenly began to be a priority in my life, and it hadn't been in the same way. And for
was
my
your
mother,
husband comfortable with this?
he is a total cheerleader. He hasn't quite followed in my footsteps, but he is there every step of the way. My mother, who had never, it was a very emotional thing for her to watch me go through this, because
Positive?
hugely positive, but also full of ambivalence, because she really regrets what she didn't give us. And so she used to try to make up for it. At every high holiday dinner, she would be trying to teach, and we'd be like, you know what, you made your choice, and we're ignorant, and that's your fault. We were terrible. But now she had a chance to kind of give back to me. She gave me the flowers for my service, and
Lovely.
I actually slept at her house the night before because my
Lovely.
in-laws were in town to see me go through it, and I thought, I'm so nervous that I just need to be back in my childhood room. And that was, had its own power.
Good for you. Good for you.
Thank you.
Can we say what synagogue you're involved with now?
Yes, so I'm at Central Synagogue
Okay.
now, which
And
is
you're
a
on the board
Reformed
there.
synagogue. I am on the board of
Okay.
trustees.
You are part of one of the major Reform synagogues. And by the audience knows, we're very proud that we provide our viewership the only place on American television where a person can actually attend a live Friday evening service every week is
And
on
there's
Shalom
thousands
TV.
who are tuned in.
You're
I know.
absolutely right. And the Central
Incredible.
Synagogue service is extraordinary.
It is. It's
And
packed.
your new rabbi is fabulous.
She is.
She is
Angela
fabulous,
Buchdahl.
yes.
She really is.
So,
Amazing.
kol hakavod to you. I'm very.
Thank you.
And in terms of your own life now, Shabbat in your home?
So yes, I now, when I discovered Central, which was again one of those moments that was kind of like, I need to be here.
And you fell in love right away.
Fell in love and literally it was overnight. I said, please, can we join? And this was before there was a waiting list. Thank goodness. Now, there was a 300-person
Yes,
waiting list
yeah.
they just got rid of because they're trying to include. But that was the first time I was ever involved in a synagogue, and since that time, it was 8 years ago, I'm there most Friday nights. It's become probably the place I spend the most time. It's just, it's very...
It's changed your life.
It's changed my life. I know. It sounds like such a cliche. I worry that I'm sounding
No.
like a cliche, but
no, you are not at all.
But it did.
On the contrary.
It did.
And I want you to just describe it a hair more, not in terms of where you are, but inside you. If you looked at yourself when you were graduating Yale,
Mm-hmm.
and then look at yourself when you were producing for Mike Wallace, and now look at yourself now, just from the Jewish perspective. What's the arc been? How would you describe the difference, and how you relate to Jewishness?
I think the arc has been connection. I think the arc has been a sense of how much has come before. And the fact that it had to have been, it has to have been, I'll use the present tense, vibrant enough to keep Jews engaged through generations. This can't just be obligation. It can't just be guilt.
Absolutely.
And it can't just be inheritance. It's got to be alive. And I wanted to understand that. And when I had a taste of it, I got it. And so if there's a trajectory, it's that I used to sit in synagogue and flip the pages and say, when can I get out of here? And I still think, by the way, synagogue is problematic. Not where I am, but most of them, and I've seen quite a number now in my travels. I think that ritual is problematic for many Jews for many reasons that are justifiable. But I also see how much more there is beyond just sitting there. And that once you're sitting with friends and unpacking a line of Torah, or discussing what actually it means to be a moral or ethical Jew. What does that actually really mean? And when we say Jewish values, I'm so tired of that slogan. Tell me where that actually is sourced and what does that mean? And then am I living it? And what does it mean to live it? And I don't mean just do you give to the homeless person on the street. I mean a daily awareness of what it means to live Jewishly. It's very challenging to me. It's challenging intellectually and it's challenging emotionally. So I feel, if you ask me what the arc is, I feel more alive. I do, in terms of my Judaism. It feels like life is having kind of more fissures, tentacles. Fissures is the wrong word. Frisson is what I mean, than it ever had before. And it's making me more alert, I think, to humanity generally and the world. Not just also my family, which it also, I think, has changed that too.
I have the opportunity to ask you a question I don't think I can ask anybody else. You, because of your journalistic history, and by the way, what did you do for Fred Fenley, who I just thought was
I
out
love
of this
that you
world?
know him, because most people don't know him
Do you remember the
anymore.
series he did at Columbia?
Yeah, no, that's what I did. That's
You
what
did?
I worked on.
Oh, I get chills. That
We
was
have to
the-
explain to people, because
Go
nobody
ahead.
remembers that.
But it
But I'm
was
so-
fabulous.
Thank you.
Go ahead, tell it.
This man has taste. So basically, in a nutshell, Fred Friendly was one of the original, I should tell the audience, was one of the original producers ever for broadcast television. He was Edward R. Murrow's producer. They produced something called See It Now, which was the first talk show. And when Edward R. Murrow was filing dispatches from Vietnam, Fred Friendly was producing them. He was on the ground floor of broadcast journalism. And he also, in terms of the ethics of journalism, he literally was ironclad.
He defined them.
He defined them.
Yes, right.
And believe me, that set a very high bar. So he then segued, after, in the post-CBS days, he started something called Media and Society Seminars, and he created these roundtable discussions with a Harvard Law professor as a moderator.
Who was that?
And it was Arthur Miller was the most
Yes.
famous, but there was also Charles Ogletree
Yes.
and
Ogletree
Luke
was very
Hayden.
good. They were all
They
fabulous.
were amazing. Charlie Nesson, terrific.
Yes. And there's this U table
U-table
with the most fabulous.
Incredible.
It's something I hope one day
is
you'll help me do it.
resurrected.
I
It should be
want to
done again.
replicate this in a Jewish context, where you get
A
the brightest
hypothetical-
people
yeah.
sitting around, and you have a question, and you let them all bring their own
Their
unique.
expertise.
Exactly right.
It was amazing.
And you.
So that was I started as a researcher for him.
Oh, my goodness.
And then moved my way up to producing for
my
him.
goodness.
And it was, it was truly the job that defined.
And they would do like capital punishment.
Right.
The major issues of the day
exactly.
were being
Medical
discussed.
ethics, all the
Yes.
constitutional law questions.
All
And
right.
you had you had Scalia at the table with Peter Jennings at the
Right.
table.
And
You
there's
had,
Donahue and Elie
Right.
Wiesel.
Exactly.
It's just incredible. Okay.
it was incredible. So
Okay.
so Fred was my first boss.
Okay. So anyway, you did Fred Friendly. Then you went to Charlie Rose. Then you ended up with 60 Minutes.
Right. At first, from Bill Moyers,
Right.
Charlie
Okay.
Rose, Bill Moyers,
Okay,
and then
but
60 Minutes.
You had iconic names.
They were
okay?
incredible.
Okay. And 60 Minutes is still the gold standard in television journalism.
I agree.
I want to know how you now view the way in which television journalism has evolved, especially for for our discussion. How you view it as it tries to portray the Israeli-Palestinian, or in even more specific, since we are meeting in the aftermath of the Gazan war, Israel-Hamas. But as you see the way in which Israel is portrayed and described in the general media, and you see how the journalists of today report on stories in general, but most specifically Israel, I just want your take.
Yeah. No, it's a very interesting question, and I would say that I would let's put aside something like 60 Minutes, because they do, at least from my experience, I haven't watched it, it's not usually on summer hiatus, so I don't know if they've done Gazan stories, but there's more depth to 60 Minutes stories than the average broadcast story on Israel. And I would say my umbrella reaction to television stories on Israel is that it's way oversimplified and sort of tragically reductive, that there isn't time for subtlety and we're missing it, and that the voices are the most strident, that you end up in television journalism today, and this is something that Fred Friendly always bemoaned, and he was prophetic about knowing how much of a problem it would be. Television now needs the yellers, the screamers, the people who are going to be at furthest extremes, or they don't have a segment, right? You can't have the reasonable people. And that doesn't mean that there's no reasonable voices. I don't want to be paint it with that broad a brush. But what I see is that you really are not getting the complexity of what is going on there, and so people aren't learning enough to have informed decisions. And so they walk away with reductive ideas. And I also think there's a basic lack of curiosity, generally in this country.
By whom?
I think Jews are curious. I think non-Jews are less curious. I think it's not that they're not curious at all, but the Jews who are curious often the most curious Jews have already made up their minds where they are. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of almost a waste of time because it's not a waste of time. They're looking for the journalism that is going to confirm their opinions. And you can find it. So in that sense, whatever camp anyone is in, left, right, however you want to put it, whether it's AIPAC, J Street, people have drawn their lines. And I think it's unfortunate because I don't think the dialogue is really constructive, and it's not. If you think, just look at where we are. We're a very divided people when it comes to Israel.
Mm-hmm. Were stories as you saw them? Even did you do it yourself? Did you shape the story to reflect an ideology, or did you let the story go wherever it went?
I would say that the criticism that I've heard so much about media bias, when you're on the inside and you're trying to get the right story and tell the right story, that is not the organizing principle, honestly. You want the story to be true, and you want it to be powerful enough to keep people attentive. And in my in all my years at 60 Minutes, I never saw any kind of ruling from on high or even message that we should take an approach on any particular story because it was somebody's political bent or because it was going to make a better story. I do think that there are times where journalists are stirred by something that they have encountered or seen that they then translate into a story that they can support with reporting, but is not necessarily the story that someone else wants to hear, or just by doing that story, you have not done another story. And that is a fair criticism. You know, just by, if someone is going to do a story on the Gazan pathos of the children that are dying, that is actually a story worth telling. Those families are being torn asunder. I do think it's fair to say that we also need to do a story about the families of the Israeli soldiers. And that is a fair criticism if that story is not done for the same news organization. That, to me, is where the balance has to come. Mm-hmm. But to say they shouldn't do that story at all, to me, is absurd.
Then one last question for you. As you now look at where American Jewish life is, and in some way, the writing you've done, both as a journalist and then having written this book, Stars of David, is it going to be made into a Broadway show?
Off-Broadway.
Off-Broadway.
So it's so nice that you put it on Broadway, but it's off. It was already. Last December, it ran for we had a 5-week run intentionally just to try it out.
Yes.
Off-Broadway. It really went extremely well.
Who did the script?
So the script was basically based on verbatim quotes from my interviews. And then the songs were written by giants of Broadway, who basically, like Sheldon Harnick, who wrote Fiddler on the Roof,
sure.
He took the Norman Lear song, and he wrote that song. And Duncan Sheik, who wrote Spring Awakening with Stephen Sater, they wrote the Kenneth Cole song. And I was lucky enough to write a lyric for Ruth Bader Ginsburg with Tom Kitt, who wrote Next to Normal. He won the Tony for that.
Yes.
And If Then is now on Broadway. So Tom and I wrote the Ruth Bader Ginsburg song. She actually heard it for the first time last spring.
Did she like it?
She loved it, which was a very, you can imagine, surreal moment.
You've done a lot of lyrics.
I actually have. I'm glad you're mentioning my lyrics. It's another reason why people think I've lost my mind. But people don't know about my theater background. I used to write songs always as a kid, and now that I'm, an old lady, I'm getting a chance to do it a little more formally.
And you even have done something for Central Synagogue.
I have done something for Central Synagogue. You are a very good reporter. It's like the layers of reporting.
Very, very good.
Yes.
Very, very good.
Yes.
Anyway, I am hoping it does come back to Off-Broadway.
It's going to travel the country now.
Okay.
And there's going to be an album coming out. And,
fabulous.
Yeah.
Well, that's a kick for you too, isn't it?
It's crazy. I mean, talk about coming full circle.
Yes.
I mean, I was this kid, singing and dancing with my sister in my parents'
Just tell me,
living
you go
room.
to Stage Door Manor?
No, my sister went to Stage
You
Door.
see? Okay. So, as someone who has experienced Jewish life,
Yes.
had your own journey, then you do the book, and you're a thoughtful person. As you look at where Jewish life is today, take a moment. I want to know what really pleases you. I want to know what concerns you as a Jewish mother, as a Jew living in the first part of the 21st century.
What should I start with?
Pleases.
Okay. What pleases me is how vibrant it is in so many places, despite all the naysayers. And that means that a lab shul with Amichai Lalavi, that Romamu with David Ingber, and I don't mean that these are just crunchy granola places. I mean these are guys who know their Judaism, but they also know that people are not finding their Judaism, they're not finding their spirituality in a typical synagogue setting, and they are reinventing it in a way that is still grounded in Judaism, but is really original. To me, it's very exciting. And I say the same about Mechon Hadar, where 3 guys who went to Harvard together and then JTS together started this independent minyan, and now it's become its own seminary, and I have studied with all of them and taken classes there, and I find that my brain is on fire when I walk out of that place.
Yes.
Those things give me great hope.
Yes.
And I only wish, I'm evangelical on this, I agree with you that Jews who are disconnected and sort of untethered and not finding kind of the fire yet will find it in that real moment of family, or I also think they can find it in a great class, in a great sermon. I don't want to underestimate what
I
Jewish
agree with
learning
you.
can do.
I agree.
And when I have found it and seen it, it is radicalizing. It literally wakes you up to a whole new world. And when it's not, when it's boring, when it's by the book, when it's cliche, when it's a sermon you've heard, and I know the next line that's coming, because someone hasn't worked hard enough to make this come alive. And I know it sounds lazy and passive. I think we need to do our work too. Congregants need to do our work too. We should walk into high holidays having done reading and gone to some of these classes that are being offered all over the city right now. Now that I'm engaged, I see how many are trying to help us have more meaning when we walk into shul. That stuff gives me great hope. What is discouraging to me is that there are still so many boring sermons, is that I hear rabbis say, well, you can't change it because it's what people are used to. I hear people say, if you're bored, that's your problem. I hear people say that ultimately you're in or you're out. You either get it, love it, or you don't. And I think that's a shame. And it doesn't have to be a marketing thing of selling this, but I think this is great, rich stuff, and more people could be turned on by it. And I have many friends who prioritize their yoga classes and their spinning classes, and they're not prioritizing Torah learning. And I don't judge them. I am certainly not judging them, but I think they're missing something. And I think there's got to be a way to make these people get a taste of it without banging them over the head with it, without not making them feel guilty about it. And, frankly, unfortunately, the intersection of most Jews in this city, at least, and Judaism is on the high holidays. That's really when they're getting their Judaism. And there's got to be a way, I think, when you have this captive audience, to captivate them a little bit better than we're doing.
Mm-hmm. You love it, though, don't you?
I love it.
You love it.
I don't love everything, but I love a lot of it. And I love everything that I'm kind of investigating and learning. And it's also bottomless, so I'm frustrated by it too. I mean, I sit with you and I know what you know, and I sit with the Hadar guys, and their erudition boggles my mind. And I don't just mean like, oh, you know so much, you're so smart. I envy the years you've had to just get it and know it and have it under your skin, and to be able to pull a verse of Torah out of the blue, or a psalm, or sing a nigun and have heard it a million times before. There really is, and this is something that I think professional Jews don't recognize enough, how hard it is. And I'm much more in than I have been before, and I'm still so out. I'm still such an outsider. When I went to Limud, New York, which is this incredible 3 days of learning, and everyone should go, I walk in there, and I'm a Jew out of water. I'm a fish out of water. Everyone else there, they've got the language and the vocabulary. It's just, there is undeniably insiders and outsiders. And I think the insiders, it's not that they need to dumb it down for the outsiders, on the contrary, that I think they need to know what it feels like to be that person who doesn't know the nigun, because you kind of don't know what to do with yourself at that moment. And that's just one moment. It's sort of a metaphor for the larger question.
You are fabulous.
Thank you.
You are fabulous. I will only let you, a semicolon, not a period. You have to come back.
I would love to.
You're really wonderful.
I would love to.
Really,
I love your
thank you.
questions.
Oh, thank you.
I do.
I enjoy
They're
you so
good
much.
questions.
You're wonderful.
Thank you.
And you're, I understand exactly what you mean about the insider outsider. You're not an outsider anymore. And all of us want to be more insider. And the Jewish community has to really embrace those who feel anything about being outside. Because the reality is, when we're all inside, it's a great tent. It's fabulous. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Abigail Pogrebin, author of Stars of David, but she's done so much more, and it's just wonderful to have her here. You'll read her in the Jewish Forward now, doing her own series, and she promised to come back. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to the things that Abby has said. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I look forward to hearing from you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.
L'chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.